Hey everyone, thanks for joining me. You're watching In Deep on the Delta, and today we're talking about tactical bass leaders. And you know, in the world of bass fishing, everyone wants to talk about the baits, size, color, shape, whatever you want to talk about, someone will talk to you about baits when it comes to fishing bass. But very seldom do you hear people talking about leaders. And the leader can be just as important as the bait. Having the proper leader is going to ensure that the bait is riding correctly and working for you, and once you hook the fish, it's going to also ensure that you are able to land that fish. So today we'll be talking about everything that you need to know to build a full leader system. So let's get into the video. Today, I'm not going to actually be sitting here tying knots and showing you how to tie knots. That would make for a very long video today, and I want to keep this video as short as I can and get as much information as I can out to you guys. So I will not be sitting here tying knots. I'm going to give you some references of some YouTube channels and some sites on the web that you can go to if you're unfamiliar with the knots. The first channel I want you guys to check out is Salt Strong. And Salt Strong is a YouTube channel. They do a whole lot of knot testing, line testing. It's pretty science-based. They kind of follow the IGFA rules when it comes to testing. They test, if they're testing a knot, they'll test it many times and they'll take the average breaking strength of that knot, and they'll do a lot of things that are much more scientific than the average professional fisherman that goes out and tells you, oh yeah, you know, this is a good knot. So Salt Strong is the first website or first YouTube channel I want you to check out. The other channel that I want you to make sure you check out is Tactical Bassin, and I want to make sure I include Tactical Bassin because in the practical world of bass fishing, it is hard to, disagree with anything that Matt or Tim says. They've caught more trophy fish probably than any two other people on the planet in the last 10 years. And they have some very good tutorials when it comes to knots. So Tactical Bassin is your second resource. And if you need a third resource, a lot of the information that I'll be talking about today may be a little bit of science-based, and when I get my information, I want science-based information, I go to the International Game Fishing Association site, and that's just the IGFA site. You can go in on there, a lot of really good information on lines, knots, and everything it has to do with fishing in general. So those are the three resources that you can use to figure out a knot that you may not be familiar with. So there are 6 things that you're going to need to know or take into consideration when you're building a leader system. Number 1, the type of line that you're going to use. Is it going to be mono? Is it going to be fluoro? The pound test that you're going to be using, the length of leader, the knots that you're going to be using, and actually the rods and the reels. And we're going to get into that when it comes to the practical application of how we're doing some of this on the river here. All right, so with that, there's going to be 8 knots that I want you to start with. There'll be 4 knots when it comes to tying a leader to a bait. And those 4 knots are the Palomar knot, an improved Palomar knot, a San Diego jam knot, and a Shaw Grigsbey knot. Now when it comes to tying line to line, and primarily we're talking about tying braid line to either a mono or a fluorocarbon line, the 4 knots that I want you to check out are the double uni, the improved double uni knot, the FG knot, and the blood knot. And I'll let you know that out of those 8 knots that I just listed, if you are a follower of Tactical Bassin, Matt and Tim really like that San Diego jam knot, and they really like San Diego jam knot for tying leader to bait. And if they're going line to line, I know Matt really likes the blood knot. And that kind of goes a little bit off from what a lot of people will talk about, but remember, catch as many fish as those guys do, and I'm going to be listening. So let's get into the practical setup, and I want to talk about what we do on the Delta primarily, but what I will be talking about today can carry over into the Clear Lake or Don Pedro or Maloney's. It's a little bit different, but when you have the information that we talked about today, you're going to be able to decide for yourself how to set up a leader and what's going to work for you. So on the Delta, I just want to start off by saying when we spool up our reels, I spool all my reels with braid line, and I spool my reels with either 55 or 65 pound braid line. Now some guys will go down to 40, and they'll have some rods that are spooled with 40, 55 and 65. I just go 55 and 65 pound braid, and when I'm running a leader to that, it's either fluoro or mono. So let's talk about, well, first of all, let's talk about the braids. And the braids that I like to use are Sunline, just the FX2. I'll use Power Pro, and I'll also use J-Braid. And you know, I'm really not line specific, especially when it comes to braids. A lot of the braids, or the standard braids on the market, are all very good. I will say that you'll get 4 carrier braid for a little cheaper than you'll get 8 carrier braid. They're both very good lines. So if you're looking to save a few dollars, go with the 4 carrier braid, and it's going to be just as strong as the 8 carrier braid. Let's talk about the difference between fluoro and mono. Monofilament has a neutral buoyancy, so it pretty much floats. In actuality, it doesn't float. If you cut off a piece of mono, you'll see that it will sink, but it sinks very slowly compared to fluorocarbon, which is a denser line. Because it's a denser line, fluorocarbon will sink. Just keeping that fact in mind, if you are throwing topwater baits, you want to stick to a mono leader. If you're throwing subsurface baits, you can go mono or you can go fluoro, and we'll talk about a little bit of that when we set up the baits here. The other thing with monofilament, it has a lot of stretch to it. 20 to 25% stretch in most monofilament. So you've got a line that's going to give you a lot of forgiveness. Fluorocarbon, it stretches, but not as much as mono, and it is a very slow stretch. So monofilament line, if you are using a technique that you need some forgiveness and maybe a little stretch, monofilament is really good. If you're trying to get a bone jarring hook and you're running braid to fluoro, you're going to get a little better, a little stronger of a hook set. One fact about monofilament that you may know, when the IGFA tests monofilament line, they test it 2 times. One, they test it dry, and then they will soak the line for 2 hours and test it after the line soaks. Monofilament will absorb water. Fluorocarbon does not absorb water. The reason that the IGFA test it twice is that they have found that monofilament lines will lose about 8 to 12% of their tensile strength after they have soaked for 2 hours. Just a little fun fact. Monofilament line is really susceptible to sunlight and heat, so if it's laying out on your boat or you keep your rods and reels outside in the sun, this line is going to deteriorate. Fluorocarbon is much more resistant to UV rays. Fluorocarbon is much more expensive. Monofilament is probably about 1/3 or half the cost of fluorocarbon. So if you're on a budget, monofilament is the way to go. Another thing that a lot of folks will tell you is that fluorocarbon is much more abrasion resistant, and that is just not true. Monofilament is probably more abrasion resistant than the fluorocarbon, and if you want to see a good video on that, go to Salt Strong and watch their test when it comes to the testing that they did for abrasion with fluoro versus mono. So with that, when you go out to buy your lines and leaders, what I would suggest is, if you're just going to buy one braid, buy 55 pound braid or 65 pound braid, depending on your style of fishing, and buy a 650 yard spool, because you're going to spool all of your base reels up with this 55 or 65 pound, and you'll find that this is the cheapest way to go. when it comes to buying your leader system, you can buy both fluoro and mono, and if you want to get both, I would suggest buying 3-pound tests, 10, 15, and 20. Or 10, 14, or 16. Sometimes they don't come in 15, but 10, 14, or 16, and then 20-pound test. If you're just going to buy one, if you are on a budget, I would stick with the monofilament. I like to use Maxima. This is my favorite monofilament line. If I'm going to use fluorocarbon, I use FC Sniper, and if you are really looking for a good deal, go with mono, and you can use Trilene Big Game. Again, if you buy the 100-yard or the 150-yard spool, all you're doing with this stuff is putting a 4 to 6 foot leader onto your rods and reels. Now you see this 600-yard spool of Trilene is about $9. So this will last a long time. Remember, if you get the 600-yard spool, keep it in your house, keep it in the shade, keep it in a cool place. But really, all you need to do when you're buying the fluoro monos to buy the smaller packs. Okay, so let's get into the practical applications of how we're going to set up some of the more popular baits that we have on the Delta. Now, there are some baits that you can run straight 65-pound braid to. If you're using a hollow body frog, I got one here, it doesn't have a tail on it. You're using a hollow body frog, straight 65-pound braid. If you're using punch setup, you're going to use 65-pound braid. If you're using a buzz bait, I use 55 or 65-pound braid, and I will also use straight braid to the bigger baits like the MS Slammers, the big Mikeys, any big weight bait, I'll go with straight braid. If I'm fishing low light periods or after dark, I'll always use straight braid. And you guys know that I like to use the bubble walkers, and this particular leader setup will be good with bubble walkers, poppers like Rico's, pop R's, things like that. Also walking baits, spooks and Sammies and things of that nature. And I just want to make sure that I go over one more time. All of my reels on the Delta are set up with a base of 65 or 55-pound braid. And to that braid, I will add unless I'm punching or using the frogs, or as we discussed before, to that braid I will add either fluoro or mono leader. So with this particular topwater setup, the smaller topwaters, bubble walkers, spooks, things like that, 55-pound braid, I use about 4 feet of mono leader, and I use 18-pound test maximum. The reason I use the 18-pound test maximum because it's a little stiffer, so when these baits like a Sammy or a spook or a bubble walker, when they're walking, they don't get fouled with the line. So you always want to use that. Again, you want to use the monofilament if you're using a topwater bait. Now on this particular setup here, I have about 12 feet of leader. That's because I was up fishing Don Pedro last with this. But generally, I will only have 4 feet of leader. And from the bait caster, which I have my braid on, the braid knot to the mono is a double uni knot or an FG knot. 4 feet of that leader, and the knot that I use for the knot that I tie my bait on here is either a San Diego jam knot or a Shaw Grigsby knot. If those are too hard to tie for you, you can tie a regular Palomar knot, and that is the system that I use for topwater baits, the smaller topwater baits. I also want to add that as I go through these, I really am thinking about, number one, the action of my rod, how much forgiveness the tip has in it, and how much backbone the midsection of the rod has in it. And I also think about my reels. My reels are real easy to think about when it comes to drags, because I use all Shimano reels. And the Corrado Shimanos and the DCs here, they only have 10 to 11-pound test drag. So if I'm running 65, 55-pound braid, 18 or 20-pound mono or fluoro, it's going to be really hard to break that leader system, especially with a rod like this that has a forgiving tip. And all of this I'm taking into consideration. For this particular rod and reel setup for the topwaters, if I break a leader, it's because I have not tied the knot correctly. And when we are out on the boat tying knots, take your time. If you've got a problem with a knot and it doesn't look right, cut it off and tie another knot. Once you get that knot on there and you think it's a good knot, test it when it's in the boat. Don't throw it out and test it on a fish. Let's talk about crankbaits. They're pretty much the same as topwater baits, except we can go with 55-pound braid. To the braid, we're going to have about 4 to 6 feet of leader, but on the crankbaits, and this happens to be a square bill crankbait, I like to use fluoro, because remember we talked about mono floats, fluoro sinks. So if you're using a diving bait like a crankbait, you can get this bait down a little bit deeper. And also, when you look at the logistics of how your leader is sinking, mono will be floating up towards the top, coming down to your lure, where fluoro will be descending, and you're going to have a straighter shot from line from your rod to the line to the bait, which will give you better feel. And I don't know if I explained that very well, but as your bait is down here, the tip of your rod is up here. You want that line to be going as straight to the bait as you can. If it's bowing anyway, you're not going to have the feel and you're not going to be able to set the hook. So with this, same thing. 55-pound braid, I'm tying the leader with an FG knot or a double uni knot, and then the knot that I will tie this crankbait on is a San Diego jam knot or a Shaw Grigsbey knot, and that if you're having trouble again, just tie a Palomar knot. Okay, let's talk about fishing chatterbaits. Chatterbaits, you've got a little bit of leeway here. If I am fishing a really heavy subsurface vegetation, maybe on a flat or out in a flooded island, or just heavy vegetation, I will go with straight braid. And I like straight braid because it helps me to really rip through the vegetation. It doesn't have the stretch, and when I'm getting hung up all the time, I can really rip it through there. So 55 straight braid to a chatterbait can be used in heavy vegetation, and I will use a standard Palomar knot or a improved Palomar knot when I'm using straight braid to a bladed jig. Now when I'm out in open water or I'm just fishing sporadic vegetation, I'll go with the 55-pound braid. I'll go with about 3 or 4 feet of leader, and I'm really not specific, or I don't really care on the chatterbait if I am using mono or fluoro. Just about 4 feet of leader. You're tying the leader on with a standard double uni knot, and when you tie the jig or the bladed jig on, you're going to tie either a Shaw Grigsbey knot or a San Diego jam. Again, if those knots are hard to tie, you can tie it on with a Palomar knot. Okay, let's talk about our last 2 setups, which are going to be worm setups, and we'll go over just the standard wacky rig worm setup. And what I like to do on this setup is run either 55 or 65-pound braid with about 5 or 6 feet of line on it. Now on the standard wacky worm setup, we've got the braid, 6 feet of leader tied directly to a worm hook or a wacky rig worm hook, and just this guy here, what everybody uses. When I throw wacky rig worms, I like my leader to be fluoro leader, and the reason being is, especially when I'm using a lighter worm or a weightless worm, maybe it's not a big 6-inch Cinco, maybe it's a 5-inch Cinco or a robo worm. Remember, the density of fluorocarbon line sinks, so instead of having mono on here trying to float the worm, the braid will help the worm sink. When I am tying braided line, you may have already picked this up, if I am tying this hook to braided line, I will always use a San Diego jam or a Shaw Grigsby knot. If I was using monofilament, I will tie a Palomar knot on this wacky setup. Again, if you guys are just using straight mono, you can do that. It's not going to kill you, but I really like the fluorocarbon. Also, because fluorocarbon is a much denser line, it carries out vibration better than monofilament. You get a little better feel with fluoro. So if you're really finessing that worm and something just comes up and ticks it, you've got a little better feel with fluorocarbon line. Now, last but not least, we'll talk about T-rigs, and this is a T-rig setup that you can use whether you're fishing a T-rig worm or a creature bait or anything of that nature. If I am flipping this into heavy cover, I will go with this T-rig worm or creature with straight braid, straight 55 or 65 pound braid if you're flipping, because again, you're in real heavy vegetation. You want something with a bone jarring set. You can go with that straight braid, and you're just trying to get that fish out of the vegetation or the cover. Now, if I am trying to be a little sneaky, I will also fish T-rigs with about 4 to 6 feet of leader on them. And again, most of the time with the T-rig, I'll use 65 pound braid, and I will again use fluorocarbon leader, about 6 feet of fluorocarbon leader. From the braid to the leader, I'm using an F.G knot or a double uni. And with fluorocarbon, I will tie this hook on, no matter if I'm using a worm or a creature bait, whatever I'm using. If it's a T-rig, I'll use the Shaw Grigsby knot, or I will use the San Diego jam knot. With that, that's going to get you through about 80% of everything that you do on the Delta. So friends, I hope that gave you some information that you can use to start thinking about the entire system. When you're putting together leader systems, think about your rods, your reels, the line test that you're going to be using, the pound test that you're going to be using, so that you're not snapping lines. And I'm really hoping that, maybe the information that I gave you here, you can duplicate that, but not just copy me. As you go to your different situations and you get into your style of fishing, and you start to know your rods and reels really well, and you know which ones you catch a lot of fish on and which ones you usually snap fish on and off on and things like that, you'll figure out how to adjust your leaders and make them work for your style of fishing. And that's really the point of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know how these leaders work for you. If you haven't subscribed, make sure you subscribe. And until then, or until the next video, we'll see you guys on the water. Thank you so much for watching.